Get your seats. Welcome. Hi. So people already know where the coffee and the bagels and the ladies' and men's rooms are. But in case you were surprised to learn any of those things exist, they're just outside down there. So it is important to feed people. My name is Liz Kruger, so welcome those of you I haven't met before. I'm delighted that you're all here to participate today. I could not be doing programs like this if not for Wendy Brennan, who's sitting by the door. Stand up a second. Many fabulous staff here, but we all work for Wendy and do what she tells us to do in public programs because she knows what she's doing. So I'm just going to lay out a little bit for you how we're approaching this, and then really the people who are going to be talking here are the people here in the middle that I will soon be introducing. But you all have packages of materials so you can also figure out the biographies of each of our special guests. I want to start out by thanking the SUNY Global Center and their staff, Johanna Kendricks-Jones, Jennifer Mark, Patrice Phillips, for allowing us to use their fabulous space here and helping us coordinate this all today. We've used this specific classroom multiple times for these kinds of programs, and I don't know almost anywhere else in the city that's set up so well to have this kind of forum where we can all see each other, talk, hear each other, have screens. It's really a pretty phenomenal room, whoever got involved in designing it originally, so we're very glad that's here in my district. I also want to thank Beth, Finkel, and Chris Modello from AARP for helping us develop the structure of the roundtable and find any number of the people who are here today, and Beth will be one of our presenters. We've had invited the audience made up of experts and advocates, and for those of you who tweet, it is 2019. If you'd like to tweet, please use the hashtag #OlderWorkersCan hashtag. So hashtag #OlderWorkersCan, which is also on the back of your program. And so feel free to do what some of you do and some of us are still trying to understand the mysteries of. Although I do have a staff person who tweets on my behalf. But trust me, it's not me. So the speakers will introduce themselves quite shortly, and their bios are in the program. A couple of weeks ago, I held a 2-day employment fair for older people. My staff were getting calls from all over the city of New York with people eager to come. We had tried one last year, I guess our pilot one, and we realized that we needed to do much more, and that's simply attempting to put some employers in a room and open the doors to whoever. Wasn't going to be very difficult to get an enormous number of people to pour through the doors, but also probably wasn't a way to approach trying to really help people who are older, who have great skills, but have enormous trouble getting back into the workforce when they need to or wish to or never could imagine how they got pushed out of the last job in the first place. So the good news is older people are on average better educated, healthier, and living longer than ever before. Many older adults want to work. The bad news is it's New York City. We're unbelievably expensive. People are living longer, hooray, which means they need money for longer. Oh. And you're not necessarily the generations who saved enough. And that's also an important lesson for the generations following us, that people need to really think through the concept of how are we going to make sure people have adequate income for their retirement period when they can't work anymore. But the truth is New York City is filled with older people who not only want to work, need to work, but have amazing skills to offer if we can actually get the workforce to, the employers of the workforce to understand what true value is actually out there looking to come and work for them. Again, Americans are reaching retirement age in worse financial shape than the prior generation, and actually worst financial shape for the first time since Harry Truman was the president. So I really do think we're at a tipping point of having to deal with a calamity. Somebody said it was worse than that. I'm going to stick with the word calamity.
Epidemic.
Well, epidemic was the word you used. Thank you. It sort of gives it a medical concept. But the fact is, huge numbers of people, growing percentage of the overall population, less money in preparation for retirement, but an expectation of much, much longer years in retirement. And I'll just give you one example of an argument that I've not resolved with the state of New York's planning for long-term health insurance. So the state of New York, maybe 20 years ago, decided that it would support and create and help create private insurance company plans to purchase long-term care insurance. And we went out and we told people, go ahead and buy this. This is what you should do to prepare for, your much later years when you may need home care or nursing homes or much more expensive health care for yourself, and you should be prepared. And so lots of people went out and bought it. And then the years went by, and about 4 years ago now, the insurance companies started closing down, leaving the state, or asking the state to approve 60 and 70% annual rate increases because, quote, so many more people were living long enough to draw down the benefits than they had calculated. And my response was, you people are in the actuary business. I'm not even that good at math, and I knew 20 years ago that more Americans were going to live much longer, hence we're going to be likely to be around to need the insurance benefits they were paying for. So my debate there is, was it a giant consumer scam? Or really was every insurance company that went into this business really bad at actuarial tables? I suspect the first. I haven't been able to prove that. And so huge numbers of people simply lost their benefits because the insurance companies ceased to exist, left New York State, and others had to make the decision, am I going to treat this as just a sunk cost that there's nothing to be done about, or am I going to try to pay 60% higher rate increases so that I can keep the benefit because now I'm in my 80s and I really need it. So I'm just saying these issues are everywhere in our society and are impacting us in so many different ways. We're going to have Beth Finkel outline some of the barriers older people face in employment, but she'll also make a business case and highlight reasons why employers should want us on the job. I just want to sort of lay out for you, we're going to have Beth start us out, and then we're going to open it up to a panel discussion, which I will attempt to moderate. And then we're going to also be able to open it up for others at the, is that correct, Wendy? For others at the end to have a Q&A section. So I just want to sort of lay that out. So I think right now, I'm going to ask each participant to introduce themselves, or do we do the video first? We're going to introduce, yes, we're going to ask each of you to a 1 minute maximum introduction of yourself, and we'll start with Beth and go around the table.
Yes, okay, sorry. Beth Finkel, I'm the state director for AARP New York, and some more later, but listening to those more.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dan Foreman. I'm a lawyer with AARP. There are two kinds of lawyers we have. One to keep AARP out of trouble, that's the General Counsel's office, and that's not me. I try to get us into trouble, representing older workers in lawsuits on basis of federal and state laws protecting folks against age discrimination and disability discrimination. I have 3 other colleagues who do the same thing. But I also can talk about policy and getting people jobs, not just suing people.
Hi, good morning. I'm Dana Sussman, Deputy Commissioner of the New York City Commission on Human Rights. We're the city agency for New York City that enforces the anti-discrimination law, the New York City Human Rights Law, which we're very proud of. It's one of the broadest, most protective anti-discrimination laws in the country. It doesn't have sort of some of the barriers that the Federal Age Discrimination Employment Act has. And I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Christensen. I'm with the Sloan Foundation. We are a philanthropic grant-making foundation primarily focused on research. So for the last 9 years, I have directed a program on working longer that really is examining the older worker labor market, who's working longer, under what conditions, what are the constraints, and furthermore, what are the impediments and facilitators for people to work longer. We're not advocating that people do that, but we're saying that if they need or want to, what can facilitate that for them?
Hello, everyone. Chris White, Associate Commissioner for the New York State Department of Labor. One of my priority areas is a lot of our bigger initiatives, our special projects, and outreach specifically. One of the, I think we have a really unique role as the intersection between where workers come looking for jobs and where businesses come looking for workers. And we hear it all the time, especially from older workers about the barriers they face. And I think we're really adept at helping them kind of bridge those gaps and overcome those and break through those barriers. And on the employer side, we really engage employers on, what are their barriers to hiring kind of writ large. And what ends up happening is they run into a lot of the same problems that workers do. So I think we have a unique role that we can play.
Hi everyone. My name is Reina Mendez. I work as an assistant director at NYS DOL. I oversee all of the recruitment efforts for the hospital-based positions with our Tisch Hospital and also the new pavilion that opened up last year. And also involved in a lot of different initiatives. One of them being, how do we look at our workforce and the different generational gaps.
I'm Peter Gosselin. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookdale Center at Hunter College. Director Finkel is here. I'm also a reporter with ProPublica, where I cover aging, but most importantly, age discrimination. I came to the subject by direct experience. I'm a single father of twins. By the way, I want you to know we're graduating in a few weeks from college. And I was laid off the very week that they started college. And I had what I thought was a pretty good resume. But I was out 15 months. And at a certain point, though I had to admit I'm not the most charming person in the world at all times, I figured something else had to be afoot. And thanks to the Sloan Foundation and others, I've been able to cover the issue. Now, for several years, I've written, tried to understand the mechanisms inside employers, tried to understand, I'm always interested in suggestions for stories.
Thank you. Whichever.
Well, this one seems to be
Hi, everyone. Okay, all right, great. So my name is Christensen Gonzalez-Rivera. I'm a senior researcher at the Center for an Urban Future. We're a nonprofit think tank that focuses on policies that expand the city's economy while expanding economic opportunity. And we've been focusing on the aging of New York City's population for the past 7 years, as long as I've been there. For us, as it happens at the Center for an Urban Future, I work on both workforce development policy and older adults policy. And right now we're writing a big report on re-envisioning older adult services in New York City. What are the kinds of services that will actually allow today's older adults, who are much more numerous, much more diverse than ever before, and have many different needs. And one of the pieces that we're writing about is about work. That people are wanting to work more than ever, and what is it going to take to really support people in that transition.
Hi, my name is Bobbie. It's funny, you don't hear it. My name is Bobbie Sackman. For 28 years, I was the director of public policy with the New York, and now I and we've taken on this workplace issue as a signature issue. And what we're seeking to do is to see how New York City and New York State, what we could leverage. I mean, we have huge economies. We could start anything here in terms of job training, preventing discrimination, et cetera, changing the whole culture of how we look at all people in general. We'll move forward. Also, and we have plenty of flyers. We're doing the first ever AIDS Justice Rally, May 23rd in Union Square. If you can see, this is, would you hire this man? Would you hire this man? We have other flyers as well, and congratulations to the website, it's chock full of information. 4:30 Union Square, May 23rd. It would be great to spread the word and be there. It's time to fight for AIDS justice. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I'm Maria Heidkamp. I am the Director of Program Development and Technical Assistance at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey's Heldrich Center for Workforce Development. Your breath. The Heldrich Center, if you're not familiar with it, is about a 25-year-old center, university-based research center that studies the labor market. And I've been there since 2006. We do spend a lot of time on older worker and dislocated worker issues, a lot of focus on long-term unemployment. A number of years ago, in the aftermath of the Great Recession, we noticed that New Jersey had one of the highest rates of long-term unemployment in the country, and that's unemployment over 6 months. And that half of those long-term unemployed job seekers were over the age of 45. We also know from our research that the public workforce system, which you can say is under-resourced and faces various challenges, but we know that it is not really well set up to help mid-career and older workers, particularly those that might be more highly educated. We have the support to not just research the issue and write a paper or do an evaluation, but to actually run a program. So we launched in late 2015 the New Start Career Network. We provide a lot of virtual tools for job seekers. We do webinars that are catered specifically to long-term unemployed older workers. We do big job fairs a couple times a year, and we match them with volunteer career coaches. We can talk more about that later. But what I can say is that we have had over 4,500 job seekers participate as members in the New Start Career Network. Their average age is 56. 42% of them have college degrees, 26% have graduate degrees. So it has skewed toward more educated workers who really shouldn't be having such a hard time getting to be employed. But we hear their stories every day, and there's no question they're struggling. I'll stop there.
Hi, I'm Cathy Ventrell-Monsees. I'm the Senior Advisor to the Acting Chair of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, who may no longer be chair as of today. The President's nominee has finally been confirmed by the Senate this week, but they're a little slow at the White House in making the designation. So, yeah. Anyway, so the Acting Chair Lipnick has one of her priority issues is age discrimination, which is sort of why she asked me to join her, because I worked for the last two Democratic chairs, and she's not. So we've been focusing on age discrimination. I wrote a report for her on the 50 years of the state of age discrimination. It's on our website. Just put in ADA at 50. There's a whole host of resources there about that. I mean, I've spent my entire career studying, writing about age discrimination. I write a book for lawyers called Age Discrimination Litigation in my spare time. And, but mostly fighting age discrimination. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with this group of experts. And in a lot of the work that I've been doing the last 2 years, I focus on harassment issues in the workplace. And unfortunately, we see all these similarities, frankly, between age discrimination and harassment, and the evolution of our understanding of these issues and how we've been silent about them for way too long. So I'm optimistic that there's going to be a movement for change, I hope, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from everybody about how we tackle this, how we undo it, and how we stop it.
Great. So clearly we have some really phenomenal people to hear more from, and I'm delighted that quite a few of them raised like the one word I forgot to do in my introduction, which is ageism and age discrimination. And of course, that is a direct correlation to the growing demographic reality. I find it the irony of a greater percentage of us are now older in the population, and yet one might assume that would mean a broadening of understanding of the fact that people come in all ages on top of all races and genders and sizes, but it's our growing percentage in the population actually seems to be triggering a larger pushback of ageism. So I hope that we will get to that in the conversation also. But now I'm going to turn it over to Beth Finkel. I guess you're going to come up here, Beth?
I think we're going to show you a video first.
Okay. And watch the various screens.
Hi. Hey. Just one question really quick. You're not over 40, are you? Perfect, great. Age limit? I'm not. I'm over 40. We are not serving anybody over 40 today. We're trying to have a little bit younger vibe today. You are exactly what we're looking for. If you're under 40, I'm actually not going to take your order, sir. Thank you so much for your interest, but we're just trying something different. Yep.
Everybody wants to know how the story ends,
I
right?
know.
You want to ride.
Hi. Hey. Just one question really quick. You're not over 40, are you? Perfect, great. Age limit? I'm not over 40. I'm over 40. We are not serving anybody over 40 today. We're trying to have a little bit younger vibe today. You are exactly what we're looking for. If you're under 40, I'm actually not going to take your order, sir. Thank you so much for your interest, but we're just trying something different. You're just not exactly what we're looking for.
Every day, age discrimination happens in the workplace behind closed doors, and we wanted to see what it would look like out in the open. So we hid cameras in a food truck and refused to serve anyone over 40.
Are you under 40?
No, this is for my daughter, it's not for me.
Oh, it's for your daughter. As long as you don't eat them. Okay. You promise that you won't eat them? Okay. I think you could just step away from the food truck since you're not under 40. And I'll bring you the beignets. I don't want people to get the wrong impression if you're standing over here.
Ridiculous.
You guys are under 40, right? Yeah. Okay, great. I can take your order. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm with that.
This is a stupid thing that really pissed off.
Yeah, I'm going to be biased if you have a specific problem with somebody.
Yeah, sure you do.
Hey, for real. Walking away, I felt really upset. I almost started crying. I was updating my resume recently, and I sort of wanted to sound experienced without sounding too old. I was like, oh, I'm experienced, but that's almost not an asset anymore. Like, I have to sound young and relevant.
Older people just don't really fit into our culture. We actually don't think that this truck is a good fit for you. I'm sorry.
I was outraged. This stunt makes me want to take action to help others who might be discriminated against because of their age.
Well, thank you, Liz, for being over this way. Thank you, Liz, for doing this today. This is an area that we all believe we need a lot of attention to. When I look around the room, we see a lot of experts in that area, so I know we're going to be hearing from them also as we go on this morning. That video, I think, tells it all. My CEO, AARP AARP CEO. Joanne Jenkins wrote a book called Disrupt Aging, and if you haven't read it yet or seen it yet, I really recommend it because she really tackles each and every piece of where we need to disrupt aging in this society. Today we're focused on the older worker piece, and actually a lot of what I'm going to talk about actually comes out of that section of her book, so I really recommend it. So let's just get right on with it, and we're going to do this and try to do this the old, new-fashioned way and break up those myths versus facts, because we really have to begin to fight those stereotypes. So many organizations are prejudiced of how older workers can fit into the workforce. And I think that's because they really don't understand who older workers are. Perceptions are so rooted in the past. So this is a test for all of you, but I know you're going to pass with flying colors. So here you go. All right. So the first one is older workers are slow and can't keep up. Productivity, but the fact actually is productivity increases with age. So everybody over 45, sit up a little taller in your seats because you can feel really good about that. Not only does older worker productivity increase, according to a University of Michigan study, found that as the average age of the workforce increases, overall workforce is more productive. So another reason to sit up even taller. Okay, next one. Older workers are uncomfortable with technology and unable to learn new technology. Okay, well, but in fact, on average, computer programmers in their 50s had higher reputation scores than the younger ones. And 9 out of 10 employees, older worker employees, actually cite that the problem they do regularly use their computers, and more often than not, the problem is that many employers don't invest in training their older workers. So that kind of just keeps that cycle going. Okay. This is the one that I really I have to laugh about. Older workers are coasting toward retirement, so why would they be interested in learning new skills when, in fact, and by the way, I want you to know that so much of this is rooted in 45 plus, right? This is not just about 60 and older or 65 and older. People start to feel this at 40 and 45. So you're going to see that throughout these slides. Just want you to make note of that. Anyway, they talk about how learning is something new is an essential element of their new job. So older workers want to learn more, and that's just kind of lost in the in the jargon of this. Okay, next myth. Older workers, this is another one of my favorites, are keeping younger workers from advancing. And that's kind of the subliminal messaging that you don't really, nobody ever talks about that out loud, but that's, it's always the background noise. That they're taking jobs from younger workers. Yet dozens of studies show that both employment and wages go up for younger workers when the older workers are employed there. So I keep going back to why does this ageism and this particular myth still exist and still get spread more? Okay, so what do experienced workers bring to the table? I know everyone in this room can recite every single one of these. We should do it in a word cloud, and not blow up really big. But I think one of the reasons is that we just don't confront it enough. And I think if I have a message here, it's about it's okay to be confrontational. And I learned that at the Bobbie Sackman School of and one of the reasons is employers really have a fear of intergenerational conflict. 9 out of 10 employers worry about this. And what is that about? That's what they're spending their time worrying about? That's kind of a little concerning. But think about it this way. 25 years ago, men in the workplace were saying, I don't know how I'm going to report to a woman boss, right? And now you hear employees saying, I don't know how I can report to somebody who's younger than me. And just as that old framework is gone, this will be too one day, I hope, we hope, and that's what we're all doing in this room, right? So, let's go for the reasons why this whole market thing is going to change, and this is the good news, okay? First of all, there's a tight labor market. We all know that. Unemployment is down. If you're looking at, I'm sorry that the gauge on the right-hand side is actually from 2016, but this is just accelerated, so the numbers are even stronger right now. And I think we're following the European trend, right? I mean, a number of years ago, this is what they were finding, that they weren't doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, you know, looking how to maintain an older employee base. It was just that was what they had to do. I mean, right, companies have to get widgets out, whatever those widgets might be. And if they don't have enough skilled employees, they're going to have to keep the skilled employees in the workforce longer. And so, you know, look at just what happened with Mercedes, BMW. I mean, they all have really terrific programs in place to retain older workers. They're doing it in their own self-interest. And the United States is now moving right on the heels of that. And of course, Christian, I know, can speak about trends of aging and what that means. So, so that's the really good news. By 2024, workers 55 plus will actually be the oldest group, and you can see it. There's I don't need to say more, except that it jumps 35% as you extend this to the 50 plus, right? Not the 55 plus. Many employers will say that they invest in training and hiring an older person when they're going to be retiring soon. And this is the one that really is most laughable to me. Like, oh, why would I keep an older worker and train them and whatever, because they're just going to leave soon. But in fact, has anybody noted how much millennials jump from one job to another all the time? I mean, so let's talk about the reality of that investment. So that comes to my reason number 2. Because you need their work ethic, higher levels of engagement and motivation. Sorry, there we go. Employees over 55 are actually 7% more engaged, and employees over 55 are 4% more motivated. That doesn't just affect them, and I think that's what the data that I showed earlier, it affects their coworkers. You know, because once you have that in the environment, it percolates. And so that's a really important point, I think. And I know we have people in the room who have worked on this in the past, so I'm not going to go much into it. I'm sure they will. But mixed-age teens have actually now been absolutely proved to be more productive. So that's a really important point to make. Not only is the productivity of both older workers and younger workers higher, but when they but it worked to the opposite effect. If they weren't doing that, productivity went down. So you need their EQ. Okay, this is also one I like. And this is kind of, you know, this is the one that I really, if you focus on the 3 circles to the right, where you need that higher cognitive skill, you need that social emotional skill, that EQ, and you need the technical skill. And look at the far right one, because that's so interesting, because that's exactly what happens if you lose the brain, you have a brain drain of those older workers who decide to retire earlier or move on or whatever. That's a very costly loss for any company. And this is the other one that I find a little more helpful, employer beliefs about older workers. You know, they do understand that they are a valuable resource for training and mentoring. So hopefully you're not training the person who's intending to take your job in 6 months. And that has been known to happen quite a bit, right? Important source of institutional knowledge, we all know that. And actually years ago AARP ran the best companies for 50 and older across the country. And this was one of the most important points that kept coming out on that. And I know Sloan Foundation is here, and they're going to talk more about their efforts in this area too. More knowledge and wisdom and life experience, more responsible and reliable and dependent. No, we know that. We all know that. This is the one that bothered me, more adept at problem solving. I mean, that was a kind of a disappointing one. And, that's, again, where we need to do more work. Back to the food truck slide, I think. Okay, we need their steadiness. So let's go to this one. Okay, this is what I've been referring to before about millennials and turnover, right? So they turn over every 2 years. Baby boomers, every 7 years. And I bet you that's not happening in their later years, right? Because, you know, that's the time that they really want to dig in their heels and really make that final contribution. So I think that's really important to know. Okay, so what does that mean for the bottom line? Because let's remember, these companies are not doing this selflessly. That's what I said at the beginning. But if you go down to the bottom, where the red circle that we've got there, it literally is the bottom line if they don't start to pay attention to the older worker. Because that's the total potential value of avoiding turnover, $7,400. That's per single employee. Nobody wants to have to pay that if they don't have to, right? So, barriers to ageism. Sorry. Okay, this is really important, and I'm going to be winding up after this, so I really want you to pay particular attention to this one, because we've been surveying our members and the public to find out how they feel about ageism. Workers, 45 plus, again, note that 45, because if you're not 45, and you're maybe a millennial in this audience, you will be 45, right, God willing, so pay attention to this. 61% have said they've seen or witnessed age discrimination at work, 61%. And workers 45 plus, 76% report age discrimination is the top limitation for finding a new job. Top limitation. Scary. It's, so what are we going to do about it? Because we're AARP, and what we're all about is changing policy, right? And so I'm hoping to enlist all of you here today in our federal advocacy, PAWADA. Can you guys say PAWADA? Excuse me. And it stands for Protecting Older Workers Against Discrimination Act. And this really goes back to 2009 when there was a U.S. Supreme Court case and it weakened the status of having an age discrimination lawsuit. Before that, age discrimination was the same as gender discrimination and disability race discrimination. They took it out of that section. And now they've made it so that you have to have a higher level of proof to prove age discrimination, which talk about going backward. I can't even imagine, and Dan is shaking his head, is our expert on this from our DC office. It's really kind of unconscionable. And the interesting thing is when you talk to any legislator about this, I have yet to have one senator or one congressperson say, oh my, this is okay, or maybe not for me. Every single one I've talked to says, sign me up, because they all recognize what a huge problem this is. So I'm really hoping we're going to move this through, but we really need everyone to call their federal legislators and sign up to take action on this. So if you go to that actionarp.org /fight ageism, you all got it, please write it down. It's really important because you can take action. It will go directly to your legislator to let them know how you feel about this issue. We're all going to be down in DC in the fall, doing all of our visits and letting them know how important this is to us. So I think that's it. I just want to go back to what Liz opened us up with when she talked about true value. You know, I think that's what gets lost. You know, we can talk about discrimination and all these other words, and we can show all this data, but we all know what it means to have that true value, not only lost to the workplace, but the true value, how the individual feels about their own self-worth and true value. And I don't think we can ever lose sight of that. So I'm looking forward to hearing from all the panelists today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. directed initially to one of our panelists. So what are some of the challenges that older workers face in hiring process and on the job? We've heard some about age discrimination, but Cathy, that has actually been your specialty area. So can you help us understand ageism as a form of discrimination, say in comparison to other kinds of discrimination we might face in the workforce?
I can. And so I think that's sort of one of my unique positions at the EEOC is because I do a lot of work on sex and race discrimination as well. And so I actually helped start a litigation program at AARP, so we're focused on age. And when you sort of get to see how these fields of discrimination are all connected, so here I think is the greatest challenge in the age area is that the stereotypes are so embedded that they're just unconscious and unchallenged, right? And you sort of say, why? Why are we still there, 50 years after the federal law? And the state laws and city laws, I will say, are so much better. So there's a lot of work to do there. But, so why are we there? And I think there's this disconnect between the stereotypes and beliefs. So in other areas like sex discrimination, think of sex stereotypes, and we know, okay, well, that's not true. And it's something that I might have a stereotype based on gender. I wouldn't generalize it to all women, right? We just know you're not supposed to do that. But people do that with age. They actually believe deep down that people's physical abilities, mental abilities, cognitive abilities decline with age. When you're like, what? And it's sort of what age? And then they generalize it from people in their 50s, 60s, 70s. And then when I say it sort of goes unchallenged, and this goes to what Beth was saying, we have these outdated notions of who older workers are, okay? So today they're more likely to be women and people of color than they were 50 years ago. They're in all kinds of jobs. The physical nature of work has changed dramatically. Work itself has changed significantly. Corporate structures, hierarchy, and how people move in and out of jobs. But it's like we're stuck in the 1960s of career man. He's gone. And I think that certainly the law in our profession, that the age law is kind of stuck, and lawyers and judges are all stuck in this view that age is different than race or sex discrimination. And what we see is, no, it's not. There are real similarities, and I think sort of the more that, unfortunately, older women now file more charges of age discrimination than older men since 2010. It's not like that's a good thing, but so the question is, will that change, sort of the dynamic of how we fight age discrimination, how we look at it? So if it's now linked with sex discrimination, or people of color, if it's linked with race discrimination, will people begin to understand that there are more similarities than differences, and we have to fight age discrimination with the passion and radicalism that we have fought other types of discrimination.
Bobbie, says she just finished with radicalism. I knew it was a self-declared radical. So do you think that there is, a much more aggressive approach we ought to be taking to challenging the laws and ensuring that we have stronger protection?
Yes. I believe that we need to be challenging the laws, but I also believe that we need to be seeing how we can have, and I sort of said it earlier, New York City and state, how do we leverage what already exists? There's contracting that goes on. There's protection. I think age might be written into the contracts, but what does that really mean? We don't even have studies, whether again city or state based, on what's the scope of the problem. We're talking here with national statistics and AARP and others who are looking at studies, but we really don't have local studies. We have anecdotes. You'll notice in the air, but we don't have a locally based study. That's my point. So I think there's a lot of room that we still have to really, and I agree with the confrontational part in the sense of there's a lot of internalized ages. It's like any ism, you know. Ashton is here, and I think one of you a little, there's her book, she's opened up her book. This chair rocks, Ashton, Ashton Clark. Every one of I hear you say is, you know, if you forget your keys, you go, oh, senior moment, I'm terrible. But when you're 18 and you forgot your keys, you probably didn't even think about it for 2 seconds. You know, so, but obviously it gets more serious than that, and what we tell ourselves. And I think it all interplays. I wanted to add one more thing, because I'm also interested in the cultural shift and the language shift. We know if any ism has ever gone, that is really huge. So here's a quick metaphor I have. I discussed this with Wendy, and I finally got to the end of my story, and I'll be really quick. When the issue first came up with gays in the military all those years ago, my initial reaction was like, who cares? I don't like the military. I don't know anybody. I am gay, but I don't know anybody in the military. And then, of course, over time, I learned, you know, how important. But what was so important also about this, of civil rights, was the cultural impact the military has because of all the people that go through the military, the integration of the forces, you know, on and on. And so that spread out across the country. And that's the work. If you're telling people you no longer, and one of you had said this, maybe both, if you no longer belong in the workplace, you're not welcome here, you're being told to get lost. To me, that's really serious. Because now you're saying you're not part of what's so central to all Americans, and that's the workplace. And so that's my parallel of depth of this and the work and the importance of the workplace culturally, and as you mentioned, emotionally and how you feel. You don't want to be isolated and sort of less than.
Maria, so we have all kinds of diversity requirements and programs in this country. As a state legislator, we're trying to rewrite the MWBE regulations as we speak before the end of June. We've all lived through the reactions, positive and negative, to having affirmative action in this country. Here in New York City, because we are sort of the United Nations of the world, for ethnic and racial and cultural and language issues, we always internalize the importance of diversification. Should we have special programs or requirements for employers when it comes to making sure that you are inclusive of older workers in your workforce?
I guess if I thought they would make a difference, maybe, but, you know, I think in some ways maybe that just adds to the stigmatization of older job seekers. I mean, we definitely are finding that we tried to use some public workforce system resources to develop a wage subsidy. So we thought, okay, we're going to partner with community colleges, we're going to market this to employers. If you hire from these older, long-term unemployed job seekers, so we said it, you know, you can get this wage subsidy. And, you know, you just couldn't get takers. You couldn't get job seekers that really wanted to step up and say, oh yeah, I've got this badge that says I'm older and been out of work. And employers were reluctant to do it. So I don't really know. I mean, you know, I think that Bobbie raises some excellent points. I mean, you're talking about minority and women-owned businesses and small businesses. I mean, maybe there should be a category for older workers.
What about a law?
You what?
What about a law?
A law that says that they have to hire X percent of their workforce needs to be over 40.
Or, you know, I don't know exactly how to articulate what that would be, but that seems to be the only thing that makes corporations bend at all. And of course, they have ways to get around it and all of that. But
I'm not optimistic that that's the solution.
And everybody, when you're talking, grab a mic and bring it closer to you so we make sure everybody's hearing your answers. Just sort of jumping back to make sure. So we know it's discrimination. We're not sure if we all agree that mandating that you must hire Liz because you need to fit in a female above a certain age for your checkoff boxes. Christian, what are you learning from your research?
Yeah, so specifically when it comes to workforce development, well, first of all, I want to say that I want to acknowledge, I mean, it's all the conversations that we've had so far about ageism in general. Because, I mean, sometimes we like to think that there's a smart policy solution to every problem, but sometimes it's just discrimination. They just don't like you for who you are. So let's just start, level set by starting with that. At the same time, one of the interesting things that I find about workforce development is that there's all this conversation, this general understanding that in today's age, it's no longer enough to just go to school and then go to work for the rest of your life. That today's economy requires learning new skills, not just one and done, but every 5 years. I mean, constantly refreshing what it is that you offer to the workforce. And this is true if you're 18, if you're 20, if you're 30, or if you're 60. Yet, our fundamental systems are still built around the idea of one and done. So it's difficult, for instance, to get something like credit for prior learning, where you have somebody who's been working for 30 years, 40 years in a field, has accumulated a lot of knowledge, yet if you go into a university setting and say, I want a degree in what I've been doing for 40 years, you really generally cannot do it. You can't just say, oh, I've been doing this forever, why not get a degree? There are 5.4 million people in New York State that have some college, meaning they started college at some point, had to drop out for financial reasons or any other reasons, and many of those people are in their 40s and 50s. Make some junction some junction in their career to say, you don't have the degree. When you were 18, when you were 20, you didn't get the degree that you need to get for this career, even though they've been working on it for this long. So there is a fundamental disconnect between our workforce development systems and what's really needed to take people into today's economy. And that's something that is directly affecting all the workers. So if I see an opportunity here, I mean, it's, again, combating ageism is the first step. I mean, changing the culture is the very first step in all of these levels. But also, changing our systems to be more aware of the fact that people are learning throughout their lifetimes, and that this should be codified in the kinds of degrees that we get, and how employers view the experience that's on your resume.
Can I jump in just for 1 second? A couple of years ago, there was a program in New Jersey that was geared to providing for job seekers in mostly their 40s and 50s who had IT backgrounds. They all had to have a BA, and it was giving them access to the latest credentials in IT in their field. There were credentials that were supposed to be in demand with employers. So people completed this program, and they had a job developer who was helping with placement. They had a terrible time. So either the employer said, well, this is great, now you've got this new credential, but you have no experience. I mean, they really had not done placement rates. So much as I'm a huge supporter of trying to find ways to make the public workforce system more responsive and promoting the notion of lifelong learning in both in the public workforce system and outside of that, it doesn't take away from either the age discrimination or whatever other barriers there are.
Peter, I see you grabbing the microphone.
I want to make a journalistic observation and a strategy observation. The journalistic observation.
Can you bring the mic closer?
The journalistic observation is that it's not on. I'm going to yell.
No.
Is this working?
I think that one is our sick mic. It's not old, it's just ill.
I said I want to make a journalistic observation and a strategy one. As a journalist, what struck me in the past several years covering this is how often age discrimination is pictured as something else, and how the interaction where it occurs is always lonely. I mean, you're always alone in doing it. So we have essentially the formal jobs hiring system in this country now is all online. You put in the application, it goes behind the veil, and you don't have the faintest fucking idea of what happens then, right? The departure, the ouster process is equally an individual interaction between a low-level manager and an individual, and it's called more often than not something other than we want you out because of your age. We call something other than a layoff. strategy point I wanted to make is this. The question asked behind you just a moment ago is, so we're going to have a law that says you're mandated to hire so many people at so many ages. I think the sort of strategic steps that you can take are these. The issue of ageism is deep-rooted, and so you cannot attack it by saying, I'm going to fix a law, I'm going to have one law. You have to attack it as a justice. This is just plain unfair. That may get you legal changes, but ultimately it seems to me that the legal changes, and making that argument, I think the truth is you're going to have to forego other arguments. It would be wonderful to think that it is a seller's market, that we're now in demand, that there's this sort of economic imperative that we are going to, that older people are going to become an integral part of the workforce. People have been saying that for all these years leading up to now. We have an economy that's now high pressure, and we still don't see substantial and, more importantly, durable results, ones that will endure the coming down. We have to, this is a little controversial, but there is an immense amount of fraud in this area. This sort of sense that we have to be happier, we have to be perky about, the opportunities that being older create for us. There can be encore careers, and we can volunteer. This is a capitalist, this is a market economy. You are judged by what you are paid to do. Volunteering is an important thing, but it ain't a job. And finally, if we can make this a justice, and if we can get law changes, the real aim of the law changes is not to set forward. It's to raise the cost of employers. Basically, it's to make Dan Kohrman's job easier, to make cases stick, to keep the laws from being cut back, as the federal courts now are doing wholesale. And so it's basically changing the cost equation so that it's less costly to keep older workers than it is to get rid of them.
Can I add something?
Sure.
We
didn't know where that came from.
down here.
And you are?
Megan Lufkin, and it's so much about image with aging, and especially I was in the communications business, magazine business, and all that. It's so much about how they look, and it's the monetization, whether it's a small business or a large business. And if you tell them what to do, they're going to go around it in some way to get around the law, and they'll find their attorneys. But isn't there something that you could make it mandatory to have them learn? Like they have to build a quota of learning and set up like a test market that we can show you. If you put an older person in here, even if you're paying them more, and the younger person, look how your bottom line is going to increase, your productivity, just having them feel it and see it, and so they can, because they can't get around having to be educated in some way, but they'll find a way to get around everything else.
So rather than telling people to go back to school and get new credentials, when that's not really what's preventing them from getting a job, actually send the human resources staff to school and show them why they're actually missing out on all kinds of opportunities to get the workforce they need in their company, and mandating that somehow. Kathy Sloan, you have, excuse me, Kathy Christensen.
Yeah, right. I have a couple of thoughts, but one of them is that policy is a very blunt instrument, and mandates are very blunt. And a lot of what's happening in the workplace is very nuanced and is very idiosyncratic to those specific workplaces. And what we're seeing in different industries that have labor shortages, such as healthcare, TV. I mean, Carol Heimowitz has actually done an interesting piece on the new streaming networks. Now it's creating so many opportunities. But the fact is, when they have labor shortages, and this is the point that Beth was making, there's a vested self-interest. And they're not looking at age per se. The problems are at the point of hire, perhaps at the point of ouster. But where most older Americans who are working are, they are keeping their jobs, but they're facing stereotypes. So I think we've got to distinguish between discrimination and stereotypes. And one of the problems within the workplace for older workers is that they do feel that they're being stereotyped. They're being seen as costing more, and some facts indicate that they do. They may be seen as not being innovative. But I think one of the biggest challenges is the way older workers may internalize those stereotypes and maybe acting on them and be trying to hide their age. And so that, to your point, Bobbie, that there needs to be kind of a proud and loud effort. And we saw this with women, we saw it with mothers in the 80s, and one of the things they did within workplaces was establish affinity groups. But we're not seeing within business affinity groups being established around age. People are not coming out. They're not saying, I'm 68 and I'm doing well and I'm productive. You don't want, what I hear over and over and I see is people they don't even talk about their lives in certain ways. So that, if they graduated from college, from high school in 1969 as I did, if I had a boss who was 20 years younger, I'm not going to know that, I was getting out of high school well before that person was born. And so there is this internalization and almost collusion on the part of many workers not to identify what their ages are. And I think that's realistic. And businesses in some way collude because they don't want to talk about age. They talk about multi-generational. That was the one thing we learned 15 years ago, is that companies don't want to talk about older workers necessarily. They want to talk about their multi-generational workforce, and they have 4 generations or 5 generations. But having said all that, the companies that have labor shortages, that realize that they need to fill certain positions because 10,000 Americans are turning 65 every day, are finding ways to make this work. I mean, Paul Rupert, who's here, is, heads a nonprofit called Respectful Exits and really is focusing on those companies that are making it work. And so I hope at some point we can talk about what some of the practices are. It's not to say we don't need, diversity statements and perhaps laws, but it is to say let's find the sweet spots within business.
Dan Kohrman's had his hand up. Grab a microphone.
I just wanted to respond. I suppose I should thank Peter and others for worrying about how easy my job is. Civil rights lawyers are not supposed to have it easy. But there are a couple things that I think are striking here, and I'll deviate from the litigator mold here and report on some research that actually AARP has done about messaging regarding age discrimination. And in some ways it's encouraging, in some ways it confirms some of the points that are being made, the observations, and in some ways it's very discouraging. Perhaps the most encouraging aspect is that people really of all ages, when confronted with some forms of blatant age discrimination, are inclined to think, in short, discrimination is discrimination. Just because, and it's not really the law, frankly. It's more protective, the law, of people of color, minorities, women, than people who are older. But that's not the public's perception. The public's perception is discrimination based on irrational justifications makes no sense. It's wrong. It's clearly wrong. It's very simple. So that is an opening for a lot of things. On the other hand, and this is striking because of the contrast with sex discrimination, right? We have this model of the family and the role of women in the family, supposedly, that has dictated a lot of stereotypical and unfair practices. And that, thankfully, in most respects is going by the boards and at least giving women opportunities and options to get fair treatment. But boy, when it comes to aging, our research shows that there's sort of this fall back to a family perspective, which is looking at employers as the dad. So there's this notion, my house, my rules. And presumptively, if you run a business, whether you're the dad or the mom or whoever, it's your house, and you know, the implication is if you're treated lousy, you know, go find another family or go find another employer, which is really pretty difficult for a lot of people and unfair. But that's just a sort of rigidity that's a little perplexing and hard to get past. And then there are these comments about, and I think Kathleen, you were talking about it, others have, of internalizing, older workers internalizing notions of responsibility. And there is some research that we have done that suggests that to a large degree, older workers feel responsible for their own aging, which is just sort of maybe an odd way to say it, but the point is that, and here I contrast it, say, with the women's movement, civil rights, race movement, and even the disability rights movement. You know, there's this book about the disability rights movement. That's what I'm familiar with. I work on a lot of disability cases. It's called No Pity. And the principle was, you know, don't patronize me. I don't need, you know, your hand through the door. What I need is a chance to get there myself, and I need to get a chance to... And that does not seem to be an ethic when it comes to older workers so much, which is, you know, don't patronize me that I make, you know, good baked goods for the company picnic because I'm a grandma. You know, I am the equivalent of any worker. And so we haven't had that sort of transformational moment. The last thing I'll say is, very quickly, we have not had ever in our experience, you know, that movement. God forbid we should really have a radical age movement. We've never had that. We haven't had ever on TV, you know, older people being beaten on the heads and sprayed with fire hoses. We don't have icons. When Lilly Ledbetter lost her case in the Supreme Court, never in all my years at AARP has a case caused so many emails all across the organization. And it's largely because we have a lot of women in leadership. But the whole place went nuts. Like, this is terrible. Things have to change now. And we don't have someone who can embody. And the last thing is we don't have leadership. The people, whatever else you think about social media and Facebook, the chief operating officer of Facebook said in an interview, I think it was to the New York Times, that age is different from all these other categories. There's nothing wrong. It's the industry standard to differentiate by age, including in employment. That there are jobs that are right for people of different ages. And that's just totally outrageous. That such a prominent figure is saying that, and no one is, you know, the president or major corporate heads are not saying, that is absurd, that's totally wrong, they're completely off base. It's never been retracted. So.
We're going to take questions from the audience a little bit after.
Sorry to go on so long.
No, that's okay. Thank you, Chris.
So in the New York State, we have about 100 career centers all across the state. We see about 500,000 people every year, 30% of whom are over age 50. And in many of them, I've talked to a lot of the staff who are there. It's fascinating to me because when people come into the center, especially people who are over age 40, age 45, they come into the center and their first reaction is, oh my God, everyone here is in the same boat. They have felt so isolated through losing their job, and I've been with the Department of Labor since kind of the peak of the unemployment numbers post-recession. And we, you know, I think so many people come in thinking that, all these things in their head. And until we have a lot of different, groups that meet together, they call them job clubs. And people have a chance to really talk through a lot of these issues. And even when, you come in for a LinkedIn lesson, for example. So we have, teach people how to use LinkedIn or other type of digital tools, Microsoft Word, that sort of thing. Every single meeting starts with a conversation about ageism in the workplace and how to overcome it and problems they faced and barriers they faced and how to overcome those things. I think that's very telling. So we help people how to answer those questions, that sort of thing. I think from the business side of things, one of the ways we can really make a difference is, one, by talking about it, but two, to really give businesses some tools to help overcome this inadvertent bias that's out there. Why in the world are we asking on job applications what year you graduated high school? Things like that. I'm going to self-segregate because I want to answer that question. So job seekers who are, who are over age 40, over age 50, will come into that, and we hear this all the time. How do I answer those questions? What do I do in those situations? So I think the more tools we can give businesses to think through those sort of things, how, it's a very common conversation. How do you, as a 60-year-old with 30, 40 years of experience, how do you have a conversation with a 20-something who's fresh out of college, who's the screener for a corporation? How do you engage with those people instead of turning them off? How do you have a conversation on their level, because you have to get through that to get to the next step of the process?
How do you all feel about the fact that we still have laws that allow an employer to say you're done at X age? So just some examples. We, the people of New York, voted down a question in a ballot a few years ago about whether our judges could be over age 70. I was sure people would say yes if you are still able to be a great judge. And this was for the top judges in the state of New York on the Court of Appeals. And the people said no. We have in civil service in lots of different job categories. You're out at 65. I recently went to the retirement party, and everyone there was in the same, because they all were the same classes. These were the senior staff of the New York Fire Department. They're not the people who run into the fires with 50-pound weights on their back, which I could understand at 65 perhaps would no longer be an ideal job description. They're the people who stand on the streets and manage what's going on and have amazing expertise, and all are out because they all hit 65 literally right now, which I think is actually a really bad thing for the city of New York. My brother-in-law is a doctor, and at his hospital he was told, at 65, you're done. That's the policy for staff.
You should tell me where that is.
Peter was talking about the more subtle counseling out. I hear that all the time, that you're counseled out because you're getting to X age. We have law firms that have policies that you're out at X age. I guess everyone thought there were...
at 60.
So I guess everybody thought there were reasons for this at various times, but don't we think that all triggers more of what we're talking about? Those of you who are lawyers and work on the legal side of this?
This was not what I was planning on speaking on, but I'll touch on it for a moment. So there are, I think, there are certain state law requirements, there are certain city law and civil service requirements that do still incorporate this into civil service. As far as the private sector goes, those policies are unlawful unless I'm missing something under the city human rights law. So, I think I don't have any sort of, I don't have such grand illusions around how the law can change public discourse or how we're having these conversations, but I do think that we have been rethinking, in the city at least, hiring practices in various different ways, and laws have been implemented that have moved this conversation forward. And so when I chatted with Wendy, I highlighted a few of these things. The Fair Chance Act is one of the most protective criminal history bans in the country that was implemented in 2015 in New York City. You are no longer allowed to ask about someone's criminal history in the employment hiring process until they've been given a conditional offer of employment. And even at that point, if you rescind the offer, you have to go through a whole process. that, asking about someone's criminal history or putting, no felons or no record on job postings or on job applications, it's called ban the box colloquially because, there was a box you had to check if you had a felony or a misdemeanor. That's now off the table. And there was a recognition that that has in most circumstances, and there are, exceptions and carve-outs for state and city laws, in most circumstances, that is not at all relevant to your ability to perform a job, and people were screened out immediately if they checked that box. Similarly, credit checks. Credit became a thing because credit check companies marketed this as a way to screen out unreliable or, untrustworthy candidates. That's been eliminated in New York City with some exceptions. And most recently, salary history has now been taken off the table as an effort to get at sort of the unequal pay inequities that women and people of color have historically faced. It's yet to be seen if this is an effective tool. But again, people would ask how much you're currently making and as a way to gauge what you would pay them. That question is now off the table. So we're changing through law, but I think that more importantly, having these conversations and rethinking sort of what we ask in hiring, how we structure our applications, and also, thinking about how we write our resumes in response to that, how we market ourselves. We even talk about at the commission that we shouldn't be asking about gaps in people's resumes. Employers shouldn't, we think that is just, it will uncover potentially criminal history, it might uncover disability, it might uncover caregiver status, family status. Like that is not, gaps in resumes should no longer be, something that you have to explain away. And so I think, the lessons that I've learned in implementing a lot of these laws that have reshaped hiring conversations, I think can inform how we approach and talk to both employers and employees around how to have hiring conversations with respect to age. And again, to Chris's point around why are you asking what year you graduated high school, why are you asking for your date of birth, I mean, sort of these rote things that have been part of these fillable forms or part of these applications, they're not relevant. We're really talking about relevant experience. And so, again, I think I'm so excited to be here because we're thinking about how we can start having this conversation that we've had in other contexts and bring it into the age discrimination space.
Peter definitely wants to jump in.
Everything you said subsequent to your opening remarks, I think is really interesting and are powerful tools. But your opening remarks, you talked about skepticism, and Kathleen, you talked about the skepticism about law being a blinders. Well, it is a blinders, and maybe that's what we need now. I mean, and I'm not clear what else if we don't use it. I mean, changing ourselves is important. There's no doubt about it. But changing the law, or at minimum, not letting the law get eroded the way at the federal level it's being eroded, is just the minimum thing we have to do, because we deny ourselves a powerful tool if we say, oh well, we're now older and we've seen the unintended consequences of legal laws, and therefore we're going to deny ourselves the use of them and making fundamental changes for justice. That seems crazy.
But Peter, it really comes down to which laws. I mean, the devil is in the details. I mean, for example, when you're talking about the age discrimination cases, I think there's tremendous work that needs to be done, as I understand recent court decisions that don't allow for intersectionality. You can't, if you are filing an age discrimination case, you have to prove it just on age. And for most people, there is probably age and gender, or age and race, or age and disability. And so I think, I think the devil's in the details. And I think we use law or policy oftentimes as these blanket terms, but we really have to be specific.
Not so subtle changes, or how about reversing the gross decision, which sets a standard for proof on age discrimination, which is near impossible to meet.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That needs to
job application, the hiring market.
Kathy wants to answer.
Let me jump in there, so I'm going to go back to Liz's question about basically mandatory retirement policies, which when I started at AARP, we started challenging them. And just to your story, so we worked on a Supreme Court case, mandatory retirement of state judges, And I had thought at the time, so we put in all this research, age 70 was the mandatory retirement. The average age on the Supreme Court at that time was like 80. And I'm thinking, okay, so these are judges, they sit, cognitive ability accrues till into your late 80s. You get all this research, they could care less. And so, the state legislature wanted to make this decision, defer to the state legislature. But when you think about it, so there are all kinds of mandatory retirement ages in federal service, FBI agents 55, others 55, prison, things like that. But it embeds into our policies and beliefs that age is tied to physical ability or to ability. So until you start to get rid of those things, all right, you're not going to get to this larger conversation of changing the culture to disconnect age to ability. But it has also become over time, age is the easy excuse to not manage people, all right? So, with accountants and lawyers and, and others, executives, whoever they might be. So we know that we have mandatory retirement at accounting firms at 60, 62, law firms 65. And what happens in many of those places, the rainmakers who bring in the millions, they go to other firms that don't have those policies. And I have many friends in those areas, and they're like, how stupid is that? We are losing, our top earners because we have this dumb policy, and, it's just so ingrained in their workplace culture. And so, yes, there need to be more lawsuits challenging those kinds of policies, but get rid of the laws. They're at the state and local levels. And the case that we litigated it was a constitutional case. Age is at the bottom in constitutional protections. So yes, I think that law is absolutely critical, but I think it's part of sort of the larger conversation to get rid of this old garbage. Thank you. My New Jersey was coming out.
Maria, Bobbie,
Bobbie. Right, so one could say that ageism is old. So I'm just going to a little bit reiterate what I've already said, but I think it's everything. Look at who we are in this room, many of us. We have probably a background in activism over the course of our lifetime. Whether it was anti-war, I did some anti-apartheid work, I did other stuff years ago, whatever. And however you did it, whether it was movement or you did it, people sitting in this room with long histories, and those who are actively involved now. So we don't come from nowhere. And now we're the generation who said we don't trust anybody over 30. Remember that one? Boy, is it kicking us now. Well, my point is that it is within us, and it is within us to change. And I think one of the huge shifts, and we talk about this at Radical Age a lot, is we are part of the future. If we continue to accept that you're going to stand on my shoulders and that's the end of it, I don't need that. That hurts. I want you to recognize what I've done, but then include me going forward. Because if you're not part of the future, I don't have to fund you, I don't have to respect you, you can lose your job, I really do not care. And that plays out on, not even just in the age, go for budgets, for services, it just plays out in every aspect of life. So I think it's everything together, and we have a lot to learn from other movements, but we've been part. God, the women's movement, look who's sitting, the LGBT movement, we could all check off the boxes. So how do we all now bring it to this? So I think it is everything. And Peter, your writing, I think, has been brilliant, because I really believe I'm not just saying that nice. I really believe that it's opened up a lot of space for thinking and fact, and it's very factual, it's really well-written journalism, to just begin for people to change and think about these things, and not just be like a fish in water that we just walk around all day, accepting. And I just want one quick story and I'm done. And I was in a restaurant and sitting, these restaurants in New York where the next table is about 2 inches away from you. And so these two women were talking, and they were both older women. And one woman said, I'm not really paid enough on my job. So there's one problem, right? And so her friend said, well, why don't you say something? And her other friend said, oh, no, I'm older. I don't want them to pay attention to me. So now you've got two problems, right smack in the middle, right together.
Maria, so I don't know how we get employers to think like what Dana is talking about, this notion that some of these gaps or what you graduated, that those should not necessarily be relevant factors to your hiring. But until we get there, so I've got thousands of job seekers, 45 and over, average age 56, and they ask, should I Botox my resume? Should I scrub off anything that looks like, 15 plus years? You know, and they've been working 37 years or whatever, and they have a 3-year gap because they were long-term unemployed. And it's hard to know what to do with them today, now, while we're waiting to get to that part where employers say, okay, we're going to overlook that. So I'm struggling with that. Part of me is thinking maybe we should own it, like Kathleen was saying, nobody wants to own, I'm 68, I've still got a lot of value. I don't know what to do, and I see you're back there getting ready to explode. On the other hand, as has also been said, I think the employers essentially set the terms and make the rules right now. So, we also get people, they ask, sometimes they seem like such superficial things, but, what kind of haircut? And should they wear stockings if they're going on an interview? Pantyhose is out, can't do that anymore, we'll look dated. We need the right shape of water bottle, or so these things that look so insignificant. But what do we tell people right now? And I see.
Well, actually, before we go to Chris again, I just I think that's a perfect entryway to why we asked Reina Mendez from NYU to come, because we learned that NYU actually is a model employer for having thought through some of these things and has a real focus on multi-generational workforce through their hiring and training and support programs. So Reina, could you talk to us a little bit about how you're handling things there and what both successes you've had and what problems you see with it?
Sure. So I think part of the problem is that people don't know it's a problem, right? So part of the employers, I think the first step to them is making them realize, hello, this is a problem, and how to get them to start changing their mentalities, right? So for us, what we have done is we started to build the awareness of people making unconscious bias decisions on applicants, right? And we did start with the human resource department being trained in unconscious bias and seeing, when I see this, what does my mind think and why? If I think of peanut butter, why am I thinking of jelly? Does this always mean that? And getting away from that. And we know that it's going to be impossible to get away completely. I can't say, I'm 100% not, don't make biased decisions. But we do want to build that awareness that you catch yourself doing these things and then stop yourself from making a decision of such. So we did have an initiative that we had all of our human resources people go through this unconscious bias training, but not only that, because it's not only HR that makes these decisions, right? Hiring goes beyond HR. It goes to our hiring managers. It goes to the different departments. So we ourselves got trained on how to train others with unconscious bias, and then went out to speak with the hiring managers about this, to just build their awareness from that perspective. So that's one of the things that we have done. And also looking at the different, I would say, gains and what, are the attributes that hiring an older population brings to the institution as well, celebrating those that have been with us for more than 25 years, having them have a special place with our dean, and going on a tour in a boat, and that's a great thing, and it brings that employee morale up for them as well. So that's just, I would say, part of the surface of what we're doing.
And apparently you have diversity training that includes aging as one of the sort of, again, when you're talking about unconscious bias, you actually internalize in your programs that when you talk diversity, you're also including age.
Right, so showing a picture of, an older woman, what do you think? Oh, that's my grandma. You don't think about, this is a very successful CEO person, so bringing yourself to the consciousness, or why am I thinking this, and, how do I stop myself from trying that? So it is part of a culture change, and I've heard the word culture be thrown around, but it is. Getting yourself to realize, whether you're conscious or not, one, I am making these rationalizations
Christensen, as opposed to Kathleen. Since you funded through the Sloan Foundation so many different programs, can you name others that you think are doing a good job and we should be looking to as models?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'm going to refer to a number of employers that have been identified with Carol Heinowitz and her journalistic investigations, as well as some of the research. But before I do, can I make one comment?
Sure.
I mean, I think this internalized sense of ageism is so deep in our society and so deep in us. I mean, a number of years ago, I was having lunch with the senior editor of Time magazine, and I said, and this was a while ago, why aren't you doing more studies on older Americans, you know, aging in work, aging in lifestyle? So because our readers don't want to see it. And their readership was older. I think it reminds us we're going to die. I mean, I think there's some deep-seated fears of mortality that really drive a lot of these biases that we have. And I think our covering them up in the workplace is also a way of covering them up to ourselves. So I think that, you know, when we talk about change, I think it's a multi-layered change. I think it's law, I think it's workplace practices, and I think there has to be just a tremendous echo chamber created whereby messages about, you know, being proud to be older, being a senior, being an elder, whatever, is communicated. I mean, I think back to what Ernst & Young did on their flexibility initiative, again, many years ago. In order to really promote it, they took examples counter to what people expected. So they got very senior partners to be these, you know, 6-foot cutouts holding their young child and talking about flexibility. And they had these around. So they created a communication thing, a communication strategy to counter some of the implicit bias. So in terms of what some companies are doing, I would say that what has driven those that have what one could consider best practices have been driven by need. And so, as you mentioned earlier, Liz, about BMW and Daimler, Mercedes, in Germany, they had a plant that was suffering real declines in productivity, and they needed to do something about that. And so in the U.S., those workers would have probably just been eliminated. But the employment laws are going back to laws, very strict in Germany, and it's very hard to do it. So what they did was bring in a stakeholder model, which is also mandated by German law. So it brought in managers, it brought in company owners, it brought in community representatives, it brought in the union, it brought in workers. And what they came up with was stuff that you could have almost anticipated and said without even doing the research. They needed softer surfaces so that the people's knees didn't hurt. They needed larger font sizes on the computer screens. They needed better lighting. They came up with literally tens and dozens of little changes. It didn't increase productivity, but it stemmed the decline, and those people had the jobs. Another manufacturing firm, Ingersoll Rand, actually has taken a slightly different approach in that they've retrained their workforce. So they had a lot of very experienced workers who could no longer do the physical manufacturing. They're allowing them to work in their homes, using their iPhone and iPads and laptops to troubleshoot and intervene when someone has a training challenge. So if someone's on the floor and maybe a machine breaks or they don't, you know, there's a disruption in process, they reach out to one of these older workers who's now working at home, isn't employed, and basically that person walks them through the steps. Healthcare is, you know, as Reina was saying about NYU Langone, there are a number of healthcare companies that are really making major advances in flexibility. But, and this is, I think, a really important issue, no company that I know of on flexibility is going to target just a certain age group. They're going to roll it out for everyone. And then there's got to be a fit. And it's the fit about the person's needs and the position and the company needs. And so, so they're doing it. Again, in terms of need, McDonald's is gonna hire 250,000 people, you know, and I think working with AARP on that. So if there's a need, then they look to either get a new workforce or to keep their existing workforce. And they do it with, you know, retraining, mixed age group teams, flexibility, and you know, other approaches.
And I cut off Chris White, who also wants to say how you do that.
Yeah, good. A bunch of things actually when I was spitting. This is good. So to put a plug in for organized labor has this built in. I mean, that lifelong learning model in so many industries, as you age, you continue to be trained. If you're not able to physically do something, in so many industries, you then become a leader, a manager, a trainer to show the next generation. It is very much built into that. And as we become de-laborized as a society, unfortunately New York is still, you know, up there, but not as much as it used to be. But it's sad to see, you know, what's happening in so many industries across the country. On the idea that Maria was asking about, you know, do we own it, do we not? You can look online and you know, as you go into Google and you start typing, the number of searches that come up about how do I take age, how do I de-ageify my resume and all of that, it's a very common question we get at the Department of Labor. The old way of thinking was, all right, don't have an AOL email address. Right. Don't have, you know, your birth year in your email address, things like that, you know, only the last 10 years. The conversation now is really about having a skill-based resume. So this is, by the way, all based on what businesses want. They tell us that they want. So they have 3 seconds to look at a resume. What's their criteria? So what are your skills? What's your relevant experience? You have to be relevant to the job. And such a huge part when we're working one-on-one with people like we do in our career center, such a huge part of what we do is to get around. People are so proud, and rightly so, of the 30 or 40 years of what they've done. That's incredible. So how do you boil that down into a paragraph or a couple of bullets? It's really hard. You know, that is a huge conversation that we have with people every single day is getting around that. But to answer your question, that's kind of where businesses want people to focus now is, you know, get to the point, but show, you know, that experience instead of listing it out, you know, long form.
So I think we've gotten to the point where we want to open it up for question and answers from the audience. Oh, Christian, yes, please.
Yeah, I was trying to find the right junction to put in one more thing. So I love that we've had a discussion, and a really important discussion about the fundamental changes in attitudes and culture that this is going to require. Because before we have any conversations about policy, it's really about changing culture and attitudes. But I did want to include one piece that I feel like hasn't been talked a lot about, and that is part-time work. So, of course, I mean, it's like you know, making sure that people are allowed to work full-time if they want to is extremely important, and it's going to involve a lot of changes. But also, there are people who are going to want to work part-time as their lives change over time. And so, of course, I mean, one of the things that comes to mind is graduated retirement. You know, so to what extent can you change a full-time job for a part-time job that has a function that's more supportive? You know, so that you're able to work for longer and, you know, change your life as needed. But the other piece is thinking about the fact that there are a lot of older workers who are entering the gig economy. You know, who are driving Ubers, who are, you know, having all those kinds of jobs that as of right now have very light protections. And, you know, if you know, so this means that the kind of work that's being done today in workforce development and in policy to make sure that there are protections for gig workers, it's also about older adults. It's also about creating that flexibility in later life. So it's important that, you know, we're thinking about that. We're not just thinking about the 20-something who wants to work in the gig economy. We should also be thinking about the 67-year-olds sometimes who need to work in the gig economy to make ends meet and what kind of protections that they want. So I just wanted to put that plug out there. The second thing go ahead.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Go ahead.
Okay, and then the second thing that I wanted to talk about is entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship among 50 plus in New York City has gone up by 45% since 2005. We wrote a study on this called Starting Later that showed some of these numbers. But a lot of people are turning to, I mean, it's like, you know, finding a lot of difficulty, I mean, it's like an entry into traditional workforce, are turning to entrepreneurship as a possibility. Yet, there are almost no, there are very few organizations that work directly with older adults that sort of navigate through the financial struggles and also just the capacity struggles. Okay, good. That it might take to start a business later in life. But yet people are still taking the risk. People are out there and doing it, which shows, I mean, like how much people want to work. There are almost no workforce development organizations in New York City that are working with older adults or who see older adults as clients. So there is an enormous gap in just seeing older people as workers who still have so much more to produce. As part-time workers, as entrepreneurs, as full-time workers, and I just wanted to make sure I get that out there, that that's a huge, while we're working to change the attitudes, while we're working to change culture, there are also some policy changes, fundamental policy changes in workforce development that are needed to be sure that they're inclusive of all workers.
And those kinds of misclassification or independent contracting benefits are issues that affect a whole slew of workers. So, the starting point could be older, but it's affecting anyone who works as an independent contractor.
Yeah, I actually had thought about the quality of jobs issue. We haven't talked at all about precarious work, about part-time, involuntary part-time, and those sorts of things, particularly for older workers. Since Bobbie did a plug for her rally coming up on May 16th at the Heldrich Center, for those of you who want to take a quick train ride over to New Brunswick, right? It's easy from Penn Station. We have a forum on quality of jobs, basically, and we've got someone from the Aspen Institute Future of Work program. We've got someone from class. That should be a really terrific event. You are all invited. We are also doing some research right now on the different experiences of older workers in voluntary and involuntary part-time work, and they're kind of startling. So I can go on and on and on.
When is that presentation?
The May 16th is the quality of jobs forum. And also, I will say, please visit our website at newstartcareernetwork.org if you want to see the kinds of things that we've got going on for 45 and older job seekers. We do get a lot of calls from New York. It's a New Jersey program, but we do let some New York City residents join with it. I close my eyes. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to just be up here so that I can see people and point to you. Okay? All right, so many hands. So I saw your hands early on, two of you who work together.
Hi everyone, I'm Betty Wong. I'm co-founder of Stage 2 Startups. Actually, I know Christian. Stage 2 Startups actually helps motivate and prepare people over age 40 to become entrepreneurs. Here in New York, we've had people contact us from India, from Europe, who've actually come to our events from the Middle East, from Dubai, from California. So entrepreneurship for older people is actually potentially a global phenomenon. I wanted to address some of the stereotyping that Chris mentioned, and also Peter, Beth, and so on. When we saw the video, we all laughed because people over 40 were rejected because they could not. You actually want to raise money for your business. Luckily for us, in 2018, an MIT study indicated that 52% of the entrepreneurs in America were actually people over age 45. However, our stereotype is that most startup founders are millennials who are now going on to develop the next Facebook. At Facebook, the average age is 29 or 30. I think Microsoft is 30. Facebook is 29. So most recently, I got a very irritating email from a great social impact accelerator called Echoing Green. They asked me to send to them applicants who are under the age of 40 for special training to become entrepreneurs. So, and they contacted me, who's trying to help people who are older than age 40 to become entrepreneurs. I just think there's a lot that needs to be done here in terms of society, in terms of educating our society, but it's a global issue, as I said to Liz. And I want to applaud everyone for their contribution. But entrepreneurship is a partial solution, not the only solution. Because if you're an older entrepreneur, you understand the value of older workers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's jump in because, yes.
Hi, I'm Mike Smith here, and I work with Betty as well on the Stage 2 Startups. But one of the things that's a common tenet here that maybe wasn't brought out, maybe Chris brought out a bit, is one of the things that's the background of this, which is both bad and also good for us, is let's face it, the hiring process in this country is totally broken. The good thing is, it's broken for many people. And it does not work. I did a whole lot of research on this last year, and I was shocked when I actually delved into this. And I spoke to candidates, I spoke to recruiters, and I spoke to hiring managers. What didn't shock me was candidates thought the hiring process is totally broken, the HR war that Peter talked about. Well, what did shock me was that recruiters said the hiring process is broken, and hiring managers said the hiring process is broken. They cannot find the people they need. So, and one of them, there's a whole reason for that. The resume is the single worst instrument in hiring. We need to fix that. We also, this thing called job description invented, by HR departments, is the single worst instrument. We need to fix all that. So if you're interested in that, that's what I'm working on. I'm working on a platform that totally changes all that. And I think it'll really deal with the isms. Because unfortunately, these mechanisms enforce all the isms, okay? And unfortunately, it works against younger people as well. Younger people tell me they get excluded from jobs for the same reason that older people get excluded. So I think the good thing is that this problem actually goes wider than age discrimination. The hiring process is broken. If anyone wants to work with me on this, I'm really, really interested in this whole process of totally reinventing the hiring process and all the systems that we use. They are totally broken.
Thank you. Oh, so many hands. Okay, yes.
Thank you.
Turn the microphone on and
Oh,
speak into it.
sorry. Turn it off.
Press the button.
Okay.
Okay.
I've heard a lot of things today, and I found myself tearing up in the last.
Just a little bit closer.
In the last few minutes. Is that good now? Can you hear me? Because I've been going through this for 10 years. 10 years. Since I've been going through this since 2008. I work in the financial industry. My last job was at Morgan Stanley in 2008. I had a great job. Everybody knows what happened. We all got laid off. It took me almost 2 years to get another job. I'm a single mother. I have a child who at that time was 8 or 9 years old. I had to sell every single thing I had, everything, in order to move, left my husband, and get a place to live. And I had every confidence, because of how well I did, that I was going to get hired back. That's not what happened. I have lived a nightmare. When you are working and you are being discriminated against because of your age, sometimes you don't even realize it. You think it's you. You blame yourself. And it's a horrible, horrible feeling. You can get all of the certifications and trainings and everything else that you want, that younger people have, and it doesn't make one bit of difference. If you go to look for another job and say, yes, I'm certified Scrum Master, well, what have you worked on? Well, I haven't had a chance to work on anything because I haven't been able to. At the last major, it took me almost 4 years to get a full-time, I've had one full-time job. I've had 2 other consulting opportunities in 10 years. I have 0 in my bank account. I have nothing. I am 2 months away from getting evicted with a child who is now in college. I have very good credentials. I've always done, I never in my life had a problem with getting hired until right now. I am at my wit's end. The hiring process is a joke. There's something called ATS, the ATS system. All keywords. If you don't have those keywords in your job description, they do not even look at you. I have books that stack this high of notes that I've taken and things that I've learned, and every single thing that I've tried to do my very best to
reality of why we're having this today. Thank you for sharing with us. Thank you. Yes, Foreman.
So, we've been focusing a lot.
Closer to microphone.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So, so we've been focusing a lot on the private sector, and we've been discussing policy solutions for the private sector, whether it's laws or job training, and there seems to be a lot of skepticism that those policy solutions won't really work because the culture of ageism, the corporate culture of ageism is so strong that it's kind of retarding progress in this aspect. So I'm wondering why, if this is the case, if stronger laws, there's skepticism that stronger laws and job training won't work, why there isn't more of maybe a Keynesian response to this? Like, why isn't the government hiring more elderly workers? Because it seems to me that the government actually has a huge financial incentive to hire more elderly workers, because if you look, whether it's at the local, the state, or the federal level, a big part of the debt is, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and that really has to do with the fact that the ratio of workers to retirees is declining. So it would actually be good for budgets if we hired more workers to retirees. So I'm just wondering why there isn't more, maybe a Keynesian response.
Well, those are interesting questions. So part of that, I think, goes back to my earlier pointing that we have all these rules in civil service that you have to be out by X age, you have to get in by Y age. So I think we actually limit ourselves in our civil service laws and contracts.
Right, and I feel that that's not only irrational, because as many people point out, there's studies that show that cognitive ability increases until you're in the mid-80s, but it also seems fiscally irresponsible, because if you're forcing people to retire, that's more money that you have to spend on Social Security, and if you have less workers putting that money in, then you're increasing the debt.
Thank you for pointing that out, yes.
Nothing about prejudice is rational. Public policy is a response to what the public demands, not the other way around. Laws don't change corporate behavior or public behavior until the public forces change. My name is Ashton Applewhite. I have been agitating for a grassroots movement against ageism, like the women's movement, for 10 years, and I really didn't want to get here this early this morning. I am so glad I did. Thank you. It has been fantastic. I just did a cross-country tour. There really is action. What is happening is that people are coming together in forums like this or in their living rooms. They know what ageism is, and they're asking, what can we do about it? How can we change now from theory to action? So it is incredibly exciting to hear the issue of culture change and the larger conversation being foregrounded in this conversation everywhere. From the corporate side, I think it's incredibly important just to point out the simple thing that age is a criterion for diversity. Only, I think, 3 or 4% of, 90-something% of companies now do have diversity and inclusion training. I believe it's only 3 or 4% that include age as a criterion for diversity. To point out also that the kind of changes that Daimler-Benz did for their workers are not just good for older workers, they are good for all workers. The same with flexibility, and the same with the gig economy. The same forces that are hurting older workers are hurting millennials too. If we don't put changes that work for both ends of the spectrum, they will be framed as expensive stuff for poor, sad old people, and that will be used against us, and then they won't be sustainable. On the Botoxing your resume thing, I know that, I stand at one end as an activist, but unless we confront the shame and stigma that lies at the heart of this, we will not force, enduring culture change. If we don't resist stigma, we enforce it. This is not to say one thing about older people who decide they need to Botox their resume, dye your hair, lie about your age. Those are really successful strategies. No judgment at all. If you have children to support, I wish you 1,000 times more good luck. We are not going to have replicable change unless we have grassroots social movement. I got a book about it. This chair rocks. I have cards. It's all about how to start with the change between our own ears. It's embarrassing to be called out as older until we quit being embarrassed about it, right? And I just wanted to say also there is a website called oldschool.info, which is a clearinghouse of free, vetted anti-ageism resources. Everything on it is free except the books. You can find all sorts of tools there. If there's something you have that we don't know about it, please send it in. And if there's something we need, please make it and send it in.
That's great. I just want to
Can I
turn
just
to
make
the side.
a quick comment
Yes,
about,
please.
so I think that, and this is probably my fault, that I don't want to say that laws are not useful here. They definitely are, and the stripping away of the protections under the ADEA is horrifying. And I think that there is real place for legislative change. What I think is equally as important is effective enforcement. Resources need to be given to the agencies that enforce these laws. Laws on paper are only words on paper. And the legal system that we've set up requires that the people who have been harmed and whose reputations are on the line, they have to come forward and sue their potential employer, their previous employer, become blacklisted in their industry. And I'm a former employment lawyer. I represented these folks. And it is an incredibly hard and often an incredibly demoralizing thing to do, to put yourself on the line like that. So I do believe, the city commission and other agencies like us around the country that are the local municipal laws that are being passed to change these conversations, or to help change these conversations. Enforcement is one piece. The law is one piece of it. Enforcement is another. Outreach and education is another, and culture change is another, and they all have to work together.
Thank you. Okay, yes, here in the front row. Microphone on and towards you.
Hi, I'm Nancy D. Miller. I'm the CEO of Vision Services for the Blind and Visually Impaired. And I'm 67, proudly. I think we should all talk about our age comfortably and proudly. 23% of my staff is over the age of 60. 33% of my staff are people who are blind. No one asks. There is nowhere that an organization, whether not-for-profit or business, is incentivized to talk about our diverse workforce. We're talking here about sticks and carrots, making laws work. We've had the Americans with Disabilities Act since 1990, but the number of disabled people employed hasn't really moved in all that time. So I've heard about some of the things that work in attitude change and behavior change, but why isn't government asking the question about the type of workforce you have and incentivizing those that have a more diverse workforce, including older people and people with disabilities? Why aren't private foundations asking, when they ask about the makeup of our boards and our staff, they don't ask about age, they don't ask about disability. If you don't ask, it's not important. And why aren't we replicating what does work? Laws do work if the public uses them. Incentives do work, tax credits, other things do work, which is why they're on the books. But what works best, and how can we replicate those things that are going to truly make a difference? Because I've got a 70-plus-year-old dance instructor at my senior center who is blind and deaf and has the largest group of older blind dancers that you will ever see. And if that isn't what we're talking about, then we've lost the opportunity to say age doesn't matter, disability doesn't matter, LGBT status doesn't matter, color doesn't matter. We're talking about what can people contribute to make this a better place to live, a better place to age, and a better place to contribute in the best ways that we possibly can.
Thank you. And actually, you raised a number of issues that I asked about before. So I used the MWBE as an example, because in state and city contracts, we're now up to theoretically 30% of contracts must go to MWBE businesses. There's always loopholes there. And now there's a state program for disabled vets, not unlike MWBE, an obligation to hire. There are tax credits. I have to say, when you ask about the research, most of them don't really work the way you think they're going to work. But there is a youth wage tax credit for hiring youth, where you get $1 per hour towards their employment. That in theory is working in targeted low-income, high-poverty areas in the state, but I'm a little more iffy on those. But I think mandates are really interesting questions from a law perspective. So that's why I was asking about that before we have one of our panelists with a response. Yes.
I just wanted to say a quick word or two about the government. When we're talking about the federal government.
Good, because that's three different and we don't identify with them.
So at the federal level, the age discrimination is a very sort of odd stepchild because there's a totally separate law. One good piece of good news is that in the last couple of years, federal contractors are now being held to standards of having to hire and maintain employment of people with disabilities in a way they never have before. So that's a good thing for a lot of older people. But it also sort of makes a point that particularly in states like New York and in cities like New York City, we have a totally different culture of how to look at discrimination at the state and local level in this country. And the way we do it all across the country, pretty much, there are a few states that are like, they have a separate age law. But in almost every state in this country, age is just another category of irrational discrimination. And so it's very strange that we look at the federal level as our sort of template where age is different. Well, in something like 40 states, age is no different from race and sex and disability. So we have the right perspective, ironically, at the state level. Just one more thing about, and this is a warning, I'll give a warning and then I'll advocate something I particularly think we should focus on. A warning is, why is the federal government not doing more to make room for older employees? Well, the fact is that the federal workforce skews pretty old. And it is a danger because what has happened in some agencies is they've said, oh, we've got to have affirmative action for racial minorities and women because the dogs didn't hire any women or African Americans or Latinos forever. And so what's the solution? Fire the old people. Well, that's terrible. And that's also a terrible approach for the private sector. People can walk and chew gum at the same time. They should be able to not fire older people and have affirmative action. So that is just a real danger that we all have to be aware of. Lastly, I love from the disability rights movement, one of the great innovations, other than this concept of reasonable accommodation, is you can't ask about disability. That's not in the federal law, and usually it's not in state law or city law about age. Why the hell not? Age is a meaningless piece of data for hiring, until maybe you have to do a background check and you need someone's birth date or something. It is a meaningless piece of data. It doesn't tell you anything about the individual. And my own personal preference would be at the city and state and federal level, we find a way, whether through, I don't know, regulations, more enforcement, or right there in the law, just say you cannot ask about age. And so in the digital space, we have found at AARP places where you have to apply online and you basically can't apply unless you provide your birth date. So they're not actually asking about age, except they're asking about age.
The woman right behind you has a question she's been dying to ask.
question for the panel. I'm not gonna-
Mic into the mic.
Oh, into the mic. I have a question for the panel, still not into the mic. It's unlike me. I'm not going to give a speech. So I think that a really important point has just been raised about the fact that older workers are disproportionately white as compared to younger workers who are disproportionately more diverse. And I think that one of the challenges that we have in thinking about a policy structure, it's in some ways easier to think about what to do inside of our brains and culture change and so forth. But what is the policy structure that creates a framework in the public sector and the private sector that keeps both age diversity and other kinds of diversity at the same time? I'm actually asking for a friend.
So this is going to be really big picture, but I think you raise an important point. At radical age, we don't want to pick we don't want to have generations, because a friend says to me, I'm not going to fight my 20-year-old son. That's ridiculous. So it is the bigger picture of what gets called intersectionality, of who will be fighting, and it's the same people. It's the 1%, it's the power of the rich, It's not much different. And if there's a culture change for older workers, it'll help, we believe it'll help other workers, partially because we hope it spreads, but partially, we are your future. Just listen. Wait, let me finish. You're shaking your head no. So we are your future. If you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, or whatever, and this doesn't get taken care of, you're going to be sitting here in the next 10 to 15 years with people younger than you, having the same conversation. So I think you're raising a good point about diversity, but I also want to raise one more quick thing. I've spoken to somebody who's African American, at 60 got a degree in math, to be a teacher, we need math teachers. She couldn't get hired. She thought it was because of race, it was age. I've talked to people at Sage. They used to have a job placement program. It was okay to be gay, it wasn't okay to be old. So they were surprised. So I'm just saying, you're raising a good point, but it's also not necessarily quote as black and white as that either. So what you are raising.
And what I think I'll just throw in with the intersectionality. So I had a very dear friend who used to tell me, Social Security is a totally racist program. And I'd go, no, we can all get it. She was African American. She goes, no. African Americans pay into it, but then we die before we can use it. And if you look at the statistics and the demographics based on race, yes, when you were talking about the growth in the older population in this country, demographically, it does skew white because we still have such unequal access to health care and other issues of discrimination that people of color die at younger ages, which is also something we need to confront as a society, as well as we're dealing with so many other issues. And there were so many hands, but there was the woman with the blonde hair. You had your hand up. Yes.
I just
Thank
want to
you.
say that we have to
start with the federal government. At 49, I applied with a very strong resume to work with veterans with addictions, and I have a great history with working with trauma and addiction, and had a great screening, and he literally asked how old I was and told me that it was okay for the federal government to discriminate against a 49-year-old. So they're hiring people directly out of school, directly out of grad school at 24 with no experience, when you've got someone eager to do a job with great experience. It was so painful, so painful. But if they're discriminating legally, that's where we got to start.
For those of us
That's
in
not
government,
legal.
I think
That's
we
not
really need to look at this.
It's not legal. Can you tell me who that was?
Yeah.
this one.
This was, I'm 56 now, so it was
Was
about
it
7
VA?
years ago. It was the Veterans Hospital
Okay.
in Lakewood, Washington.
No, actually, the age law for federal employees is a bit more protective than it is for private employees. And, but not to say that there is age discrimination by federal agencies. And again, it's sort of the same system that Dana was saying. It puts the burden on the older person who's been discriminated against to basically enforce the law.
It's a terrible, I'm also a single mom, it's a terrible, I was like, do I continue to job hunt or do I, take on the government? But he said you don't have time to get your 20 years in before you get he justified it on the phone, and I was like, do I call Michelle Obama? What do I do?
Good old days. Maybe you can touch base afterwards. All right, hands. No, your hand wasn't up yet, sorry. That gentleman at the end was, and then I'll go back over here.
I've been involved in a lot of these I've been involved in a lot of these conversations over the years, and I'm struck always by the fact that there's this gigantic elephant in the room that nobody names. The problem here is employers.
Yes.
Period. You can do the laws, you can do the policy, you can blather, you can talk about ages and whatever. Employer practices are the source of the problem. I've been a consultant in the field of flexible work for 35 years. I am 73. Starting in 1986, we promoted a menu, flex time, job sharing, part-time, etc., and phased retirement. American Management Association published a book on that menu. The second edition, they struck the chapter on phased retirement because nobody was interested in that. I consulted to 100 companies for 21 years before I had a client to do phased retirement. And they were desperate. They had almost driven themselves into obliteration because they were going to lose their rock stars in their science field, and they were a biotech startup. And they were going to go under if they didn't do it. It was a pain in the ass to do it with them, and they needed it to survive. Companies don't like old people. Period. The good thing about being an old white guy is you can talk to the old white guys who run companies. And they actually think you're one of them, and so they tell you what they think. And they don't like old people. They treat them like human capital, just like a piece of machinery. You buy it, you under-maintain it for 30 years, you dump it, and you get a new, cheaper model. Period. That's been the habit for 50 years. It's not about culture, it's not about attitudes, it's not about... They have habits, and the habit is you buy them young, you use them for 30 years, you dump them.
I do think it is about culture. That being an accepted...
Well, you can call it culture, but it is ingrained organizational habit without thought. So there are lots of rational reasons that they should value old people, but they don't get there. They're not having them. It's like trying to undo the opioid crisis with PSAs. They are deeply ingrained in these habits. So I think our inspiration should be Parkland and the Me Too movement. People, I mean, you can have a vague grassroots movement. What you need is an organization of... The biggest problem with old people, I'm one, is they're too nice. We have to stop being so nice. There is predatory behavior going on, and just as Harvey Weinstein got called out, and a whole bunch of people have fallen, read Peter Gosselin's article about IBM. It is a predatory corporation when it comes to older people, and it should be held to account. And they're, they have as many diversity and inclusion awards as Harvey Weinstein had Oscars. Equal numbers.
So can I jump in there?
So.
Because thank you for calling out just as the Me Too movement and sort of other movements. And again, as many have said, we haven't had our sort of our age movement. The optimistic side of me is like, okay, here it comes, because I had pinned my hopes on boomers, and it hasn't happened. So here's sort of the difference. So I'll tell you what we're looking at, and I can't say this is from federal policy, because this is like me and the acting chair at the moment. But so in thinking about the strategies that we're taking from the Me Too movement on changing, so this is kind of flipping employer practices, because they're getting hit. They're getting hit hard, so public shaming, frankly, whatever works. And so the strategy now in confronting workplace harassment and changing it is to flip it from like, don't harass, don't discriminate, because they've known that forever, right? And that hasn't worked. So it's flipping, and this goes to the more positive side of, having workplace practices that require respectful treatment. Now, some will say, oh, that's sort of lolly-lolly, okay? But when you frankly embed that in the practices, so it's level playing field, you gotta like treat people fairly. Well, that turns out to be good for business, because then you're more attractive as a business. You don't lose people, you don't get publicly shamed, you don't lose millions of dollars. So we're trying to sort of change the same thing in the strategies we think about with older workers as well, because it goes to this point that sort of what's good for them is actually good for all the others in the workplace. So to think about it from that, so that is sort of my optimistic side, that there's a lot to learn from Me Too, and hell, I'll take whatever I can that might work in this area and go for it. Because here's the other thing, those other generations, the Gen Xers are now in their 50s. The millennials are only a couple years behind being covered by the federal law. So we're all in this together, and so let's just figure out like what's working in these other places and take it and run with it to change the business practices, because it ain't gonna happen unless we do that.
I'm gonna take a question from the back, and then maybe you'll answer it. Yes.
Hi, Jack Kupferman from Great Panthers. First of all, I want to say thank you for such a really fantastic set of comments and suggestions. And once again, Liz and Wendy, great organization. Thank you. But one of the things that I wanted to do is a big overarching frame. We're talking about so many different critical issues with regard to age and employment and discrimination. I was listening to the WHO's, I think it was Alana officer, talking about what works, about confronting ageism and World Health Organization, what works. And one of the things that was surprising to me was that they were saying two things work: intergenerational contact and education. That helps reduce ageism. That is much, if we could frame it, and then the third thing that was not discussed was kind of the movement, the activism. But if we can frame what we're doing here, and much of what we're talking about falls into these categories. There's the intergenerational contact in education, intergenerational contact, younger versus older people working together. They see that they have commonalities in terms of discrimination and many other things. They don't know what each other's concerns are. And once that happens, not to say any of this is ever going to end, but it may be reduced. Then on the issue of education, which is what so many of these comments have been about employer programs, or just telling the AARP discussions, that great little video. These are all education. How do we get those things out to millions of potential employers, as well as to people who are in the job market? That's one thing. May I? And then the other thing that we were talking about is that issue of visibility and activism. To put it out in that this is not acceptable anymore, in whatever realm it may be. That's where this group is headed. And this is an enormously wonderful opportunity. It may not help you in your job search at this moment, but it may open opportunities. And I just wanted to use this as a big frame. And thank you.
Thank you. And you know what, I am going to turn it to the Department of Labor, because how do we get this information out to employers? Because that's what your agency's job is, so that they understand both the values of actually keeping and hiring older workers, that they understand the models of successful diversification and non-biased training
Yep.
in their own corporations.
So.
And we reinforce even when there are laws they're supposed to be following.
No, absolutely. And what I'll use for that is a couple of parts from the past that I worked on. One, which Dana is aware of because we worked together on this, is sexual harassment training. So I was part of the group that did New York State sexual harassment training, which every employer in New York State has to train their workers. New York City has a very similar law. And it was shocking to me going through this process. So we spent hours and hours and weeks putting materials together and speaking with advocates. The thing that shocked me when we rolled it out was that businesses, usually it was in private conversations, would turn to us, especially these like very large business groups, and say, thank you. We heard from our members, or small business would say, I heard from my employees. I didn't know how to talk to my employees about this. This gave me a tool and a mechanism to have a conversation with my employees that I could never have had before. Yes, as government, we had to twist their arm to get them to do that, but they were looking for a tool to do it, and they had one, and they are using it. I think the same, a very similar line can be drawn to a couple years ago. I spearheaded for the department gender wage gap report, and we went out and spoke with groups all over the state and held hearings about how to close the gender wage gap, provided recommendations. And one of the things that came out of that was we need to provide guidance to businesses. Separate from all the laws, all that, we need to tell businesses, look, if you want to close the gender wage gap, one, you know it's beneficial, right? Having an inclusive workforce is beneficial, yada, yada. But how do you start to do that? So we've been working on putting this together as coming out of that. And it became very clear early on that it is not just about having equal genders in the wage gap, or in the workplace. It is about having people with disabilities in the workplace. It is about race and ethnicity and age. Age diversity in the workplace is a proven tool to boost productivity. I mean, that's a fact. But a lot of businesses, even knowing that fact, have no clue where to start. And so one of the things that we're going to be working on, and I invite all of you, and I'm hoping I get a flood of people come up to me afterward, one of the things we really want to do is make sure that the guidance we're providing to businesses is meaningful and accurate and all of that. So I definitely invite you, give me your business cards at the end, because we really want to have this conversation going forward so we can deliver to businesses a product that actually works and helps people, break down these barriers.
Can I just add one quick thing?
No, because other people had their hands up earlier, and we only have room for 2 more, so I apologize. There's this young woman right by the door. It's going to diversify the universe of people asking questions.
I have, and I will disclose that I am 29 years old sitting in this room.
I thought you were
and I'm going to guess that that's not the majority in this room either. And I think that that's part of the problem, is that what are we doing to get more people that are my age in the room like this having this conversation? I'm 29 years old, and I'm an employment specialist that works with a population that's mainly 60 and up. And I train them every single day on how to get work. And when I make them feel more confident, when I teach them how to scrub their resume, which there's nothing wrong with that, because it's just making it a little bit more unbiased on the employer's part, there's nothing wrong with that. And when I tell them, what are the assumptions that people make about you? We know that that's true. You know that age discrimination is a thing. So what are you doing to prove to the employer that that's not a factor? An assumption is what? You don't know how to use social media, right? Put your social media links on your resume. Talk about a tweet that you saw the company tweet about the other day, right? So I think the other thing that we have to talk about is what is already out there, what resources are already doing this type of work, and where are the dollars that are going to us, the ones that already got the process going on, right? So we can expand it a bit better. We have a whole senior services team here that assists all the artists in New York City that are actors, dancers, retired dancers, or stage managers, whatever, right? We help a lot of people in New York City, and we need more funding so that we can expand our programming to keep doing this work, right? So how can all of you in this room do something different? If there's 50 of you in this room today, how are you gonna help someone over the age of 50 after you leave this room today to get them a job? Rallying is great, creating laws or whatever, that's all wonderful, but at the same time, what are you doing on a grassroots level, on the ground, to actually help people get work? We just all need to learn. And also, another thing to be said is, I do a lot of job search over 50 classes. I do. And one thing I tell them is, young people are intimidated by you. So let's teach you how to interview a bit better. Because you're saying things that you think that they want to hear, but it's just intimidating them because they are younger than you. So think back to when you were younger and what you liked about having a colleague that was over a certain age, right? That's going to be patched for me when I'm older, right? So I just wanted to, that's my goal. I want to be patched when I grow up. But I just wanted to say that I really think that more dollars towards training, going into businesses and teaching them that their applications need to change, and also getting some type of organic way to have people like me that are young that could prevent this in the future would be more helpful.
So we unfortunately run out of time, although not questions and comments. So first of all, I want to thank everyone who participated here today, our guests at the table, in the audience who could have been at the table if we had a big enough table. People have signed in, people can find each other through Wendy. If you're hearing things and you don't grab each other and grab cards, I encourage everyone to continue networking. Clearly we've done a good job of urging more people to participate in the radical aging movement based on conversations here today. And I think we came up with a lot of really solid recommendations for going forward. So I want to thank you all so much for your participation. Thank you.